David Carter returned to his old house after many years away, but instead of the laughter of reunion, he heard muffled cries rising from the locked basement. When he broke down the door and rushed in, he froze at the sight of his daughter tied up, her mouth gagged, her terrified eyes begging for help. Who had locked the child inside her own father's house? And why did the man who called himself stepfather calmly say it was nothing more than child's play? David Carter pushed the old wooden door open and stepped inside. The house was still, so cold and lifeless that he felt its strangeness in his very first breath. No sound of little feet running toward him, no bright laughter once echoing through the hallway. Only a silence heavy as stone pressed against his chest. He called softly, "Anna," his voice roughened by the dust of the road and the long years apart. No reply came, only the echo of his own voice bouncing back at him. He didn't sit down, didn't glance around, but walked straight through the hall. Instinct drove him the way it once had on patrol in war zones. Find the target, waste no time. The living room door hung ajar, empty inside. He pushed open the kitchen, cold and bare. The windows were sealed tight, dampness clung to every surface. Each step made the wooden floor groan, a sound that reminded him this house no longer welcomed him. David called again, louder this time. "Anna!" His voice rang out, but silence answered. He stopped, heart pounding, tilting his head to listen. In that silence, he caught a faint sound so slight, yet enough to freeze his blood. A muffled sob, trembling, as if someone was trying to cry but couldn't. It wasn't coming from any room upstairs. It was rising from beneath the floor. He moved to the end of the hallway, where the basement door was shut tight. His hand gripped the knob, the metal icy, his palm slick with sweat. David drew in a deep breath, every muscle tensed, his gut certain. Anna was down there. David was still sitting frozen in the chair when a strange sound tore through the heavy silence of the house. At first it was faint, like wind sneaking through a crack in the door, but then it sharpened into a hoarse, trembling scream coming from deep beneath the floor. He shot up, his heart pounding against his chest. This wasn't an illusion, it was the cry of a child. He held his breath, ears straining, eyes wide, and then he heard it again clear, cutting through the air. "Daddy!" It was Anna's voice, raw and broken. The shock ran through him like a jolt of electricity. Without another thought, he bolted toward the hallway that led down to the basement. The basement door was still in its place, but now it was sealed shut with a heavy iron padlock, cold under the weak light, streaming in from the window slit. David grabbed the handle and pulled hard. Nothing. The scream below rose again, fractured, desperate, stabbing at his skin like needles. He shouted his daughter's name, then spun around looking for something to break it open. In the corner, a rusted crowbar leaned against the wall, the exact tool he needed. He seized it without hesitation and swung it down onto the lock. The metallic clang rang out sharp and loud, each blow echoing through the cramped space, mixing with Anna's cries that grew more frantic with every strike. The lock shattered after 3 brutal hits. He kicked the door open, the hinges shrieking as it swung wide. A blast of damp, stale air hit him in the face, thick with a sour stench that nearly made him gag. A rickety wooden staircase led down into pitch black, the light from above barely catching the floating dust. He charged down, boots creaking on the steps, ears locked on the faint sobs trembling in the dark. "Anna!" he called, his voice rough, cracking. No answer came, only the sound of muffled whimpering. He yanked a lighter from his pocket, flicked it on, and the dim yellow flame jumped to life, pushing back a few feet of the darkness. It lit up patchy walls, stained with damp marks, shaped like handprints. He swept the flame across the room and caught sight of a broken chair, a few collapsed crates, and in the corner, huddled small and trembling, was a child. Her arms were bound with strips of cloth, her mouth sealed with tape, her eyes wide with terror. "Anna!" David stopped cold. His blood rushed to his face, his mind spun. He stumbled forward, dropped to his knees, and with shaking hands ripped the tape from her mouth. The sound of her gasping for air filled his ears, ragged and desperate, like wind clawing through a barren field. He tore at the fabric around her wrists, then pulled her into his chest. Her whole body shook, her face smeared with dirt, thin wrists scarred with deep purple welts. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered, before bursting into sobs that ripped through the basement air. David clutched her tighter, his chest locked up, his heart torn between raw pity and searing rage. But just as he held her, another sound came crashing down from above the basement door, slamming shut, heavy, final, as if someone had just locked them both inside. David still held Anna tight in his arms, his heart pounding like war drums. The sound of the door slamming shut above them had made the air in the basement even heavier. He looked up, the flicker of the lighter casting shadows across the face of the man blocking the doorway, Victor Hale. His shadow stretched long down the steps, steady as a wall. "What the hell are you doing in my house, David?" His voice was low, hard, and it carried across the room like stone grinding against stone. David pulled his daughter closer, forcing his breath to stay even, but the fury inside him swelled like fire rolling through dry grass. "She was tied up down here," David growled, each word forced out between clenched teeth. "This isn't a damn game." Anna buried her face against his chest, sobbing. Victor stepped down a few stairs, his leather shoes pounding against the rotted wood, each thud like a hammer keeping David's rage on a short leash. "Just a child's play," Victor said flatly, his voice dripping contempt. "She's wild, she's stubborn, and I discipline her my way. You don't have any rights here anymore." David rose to his feet in one sharp motion, one arm holding Anna close, the other wrapped tight around the crowbar. His body shook, not from fear but from the fury pressing against his ribs, ready to explode. He had seen combat where enemies left no room for weakness, but he had never felt cornered the way he did now. This wasn't some soldier in uniform standing in front of him. It was a man hiding behind the word family, using it as a shield while he hurt David's little girl. He wanted to lunge forward, to smash that smug face, but Anna's trembling breaths against his chest pulled him back to the present. Victor's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes locked on David. "You've been gone too long. Now everything here belongs to me. Rachel knows that too." The name fell into the room like ice. David's jaw tightened, every muscle straining to hold back the fire inside. He knew if he lost control, he could lose everything in one reckless swing. His mouth set into a hard line, his voice choked but sharp. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, I swear you'll regret it." Victor didn't move, his eyes dark and unyielding, daring David to act. The air pressed in on them, thick and tight. From above, the steady ticking of the hallway clock drifted down, marking each second of the standoff. David drew a slow breath, swallowing down the rage that threatened to burn him alive, and started up the stairs with Anna in his arms. But as soon as his boot touched the first step, Victor shifted, blocking the way, the cheap reek of cologne mixing with the rank sweat clinging to him. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said, quiet, his words cutting sharp as a blade dragged against skin. David froze, his insides seething, his stare fixed like the barrel of a loaded gun. Yet his arm still circled Anna, holding her tight. In that moment, the line between violence and restraint was no thicker than a strand of hair. And then, from upstairs, came the sound of a door opening, soft but clear, followed by the slow, deliberate footsteps of Rachel moving down the hallway toward them. David carried Anna up from the basement, each step heavy, as if he had a block of stone strapped to his back. Victor still stood there watching in silence, while Rachel had just come out from the hallway, her hair messy, her eyes hollow and bruised like she hadn't slept in days. David laid his daughter down on the sofa, his hand trembling as he brushed back the damp strands of hair stuck to her forehead. Anna still hiccuped with little sobs, her crying tapering off into nothing but exhaustion that left her body limp. He reached for her wrist to comfort her, and at that moment his eyes locked on the bruises, dark bands stretching across her skin, marks from something wound tight. His chest tightened, ice spreading through his veins. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice rough, trying to keep calm but his chest pressing like it was about to burst. Anna turned her face away, eyes wet, refusing to meet his gaze. David looked up at Rachel. She stood a few feet away, her hand clutching the edge of her shirt, her eyes drifting somewhere else. No explanation, no outrage, just silence that weighed heavier than anything Victor could have thrown at him. He could see the avoidance in her eyes, and it chilled him more than outright defiance ever could. "Rachel," he said slowly, each word sharpened, "do you see this? She was tied up in the basement. She's covered in bruises. I need to hear it from you." But she kept quiet, her lips pressed together, her eyes lowered. The space thickened, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall, pounding out seconds like a hammer. David felt like he was talking to a stranger, not the woman who had once been his wife, who had once shared this roof with him. Victor stepped forward, slipping his words in smooth as oil. "She's just a kid, gets scratched up easy. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I'm the one responsible here." David whipped his head toward him, fire flaring in his eyes, but he held himself back, remembering Anna trembling at his side. He knew one rash move would give Victor all the excuse he needed to twist the story. David sat down next to his daughter, his broad hand resting on her tiny shoulder, as if to pour whatever strength he had left into her. "Anna, tell me what happened," he said, his voice shaking but steady in its demand. She pressed her lips together, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she shook her head, her hands clutching the hem of her shirt. Her silence carved deeper into his chest than any words could. He looked back at Rachel, his eyes pleading, trying to pull her through the wall of silence she was hiding behind. But instead of speaking, she turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving behind only a whisper so faint it could have been the wind slipping through a crack in the door. I don't know anything. Her words fell heavier than stone, leaving David staggered. He sat for a long moment, staring at his daughter as she finally drifted into sleep from sheer exhaustion. He gently rolled up her sleeve and saw the bruises were worse than he thought, some of them shaped like fingerprints pressed too hard into her small arms. His mind spun with questions, each one a blade cutting into his thoughts. He knew something darker was happening inside this house, and Rachel's silence wasn't helplessness, it was cover. David lifted the family photo frame from the table, his eyes landing on the faded smile frozen in time. That image of the past was bright and whole, a cruel mirror to the darkness of the present. He set the frame back down, his fist curling tight, nails biting into his skin. His chest heaved, torn between dread and the rage that begged to be unleashed. Then, from outside in the yard, came a sound something sharp, out of place. The clatter of a trash can lid flipping. David glanced toward the window just in time to see the shadow of someone dropping a plastic bag, the faint logo stamped across it barely visible in the dim light. Helix Research Labs. David stood still at the window, his eyes fixed on the plastic bag, tumbling across the yard in the wind. The logo, though faded, was still clear enough to recognize, and just that glimpse sent a cold shiver down his back. But before he could move toward it, Victor's voice came from behind, low and clipped, each word carried like a man holding all the cards. What right do you think you still have here, David? David turned and saw him standing tall, arms crossed, face so calm it was almost obscene. Rachel was no longer in the room. It was just David and Victor, like two men in a courtroom with no judge, no jury. Victor stepped closer, his eyes passing over Anna, asleep on the sofa, before settling on David. You've been gone too long. I'm the one with the guardianship papers. I'm the legal stepfather. He emphasized every word, pressing right into David's weakest point. David's chest clenched. On the battlefield, the enemy might carry a gun, but here Victor held the kind of paper that could turn a father's act of protection into a crime. David tried to keep his voice low, steady, but the anger rose in him like a fire choking off his breath. A real father doesn't tie his daughter up in a basement, he said, his teeth grinding together. But Victor only smirked, a thin smile lacquered with coldness. Do you have proof? Who do you think the police will listen to? A veteran back from war with a medical record full of scars, or a man with a steady job, a home and a wife? That last word he drove like a hammer into David's chest. David felt the blood boil through his veins, but his body was heavy, chained by helplessness. Every word out of Victor's mouth was legally true, yet morally wrong in every breath. He looked at Anna, her small body curled in uneasy sleep, then back at Victor, who stood there like stone, solid in his false authority. You should leave, Victor said, lowering his voice almost to a whisper but sharp enough to slice through skin. Before I call the cops and tell them you broke in, that you tried to kidnap her, an unemployed veteran doesn't get to decide this child's future. Stay around here, and things will only get worse for you. David took a long breath, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles whitened. He wanted to lunge at him, to wipe that smug grin off his face. But then Anna stirred, her eyes fluttering open, tired and uncertain, pulling him back like a rope around his chest. He knew if he made a scene now, every legal door would slam shut in his face. He slung his pack over his shoulder, his body weighted down as though he carried a cross. At the doorway, he looked Victor straight in the eye, fire sparking but his voice tight, almost breaking. I won't let this stand. Victor only smirked, saying nothing, his hand pushing the door shut behind David. The metallic click of the lock rang out, dry and final, echoing in David's ears like the clank of chains. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the plastic bag further across the yard. It flipped open as it rolled, spilling just enough to reveal a scrap of paper inside, scrawled in rough handwriting, Sample EH, reaction strong. David walked down the narrow path leading away from the house, each step heavy as if his boots were filled with lead. Behind him, the wooden door had been locked, and the metallic echo of that latch still rang in his head. But in his chest, the fire of rage was cooling, replaced by a sheet of ice, cold, sharp, deliberate. He knew he couldn't win with fists. Charging at Victor would only end with him in cuffs. The only way forward was quiet and steady, collecting proof, piece by piece, until the truth stood so tall no one could deny it. He stopped at the corner of the porch, glancing back at the living room window. A faint glow spilled across the glass. He remembered installing the home security cameras himself years ago, running wires through the living room, the kitchen, even the hallway that led to the basement. And though he had left, Rachel had never bothered to tear them out. If the hard drive was still there, it might hold everything Victor had done. That was the one way out he could see now. Night fell quick, shadows swallowing the yard. David circled around back, his shoes crunching through dry grass. He moved like he had in the war, each step measured, each shift of weight meant to stay silent. The kitchen window was left cracked, a narrow strip of yellow light spilling out. He pressed himself against the wall, listening. Inside, Rachel and Victor's voices floated, whispers too low to catch every word, but clear enough in tone. Victor barking commands, Rachel answering short, her voice tight and broken. David closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with resolve set deep. He crept to the storage room at the back of the hall. The door was latched with nothing more than a simple bolt. His pocket knife was all he needed to pry it loose. Inside the dark, he felt his way to the breaker box and flicked a switch, cutting the current for a few minutes. The lights inside flickered and died. Victor's irritated voice carried out, sharp and frustrated, "This damn old system again." That was the opening David needed. He slid into the small technical room where the storage drive was kept. The metal box sat on a shelf, coated in dust, wires snaking across it. David yanked the plug, pulled the hard drive free, and shoved it into his pack. His movements were clean, precise, practiced. His heart pounded fast, but his head was steady, almost calm. He knew this was only the first step, but one that gave him an edge. By the time the lights flickered back on, he was already gone, slipping through the yard, crouching low past the short fence at the garden's edge. The night wind cut through, carrying the sour smell of rotting leaves. David stopped at the roadside, adjusted the strap of his pack. The hard drive didn't weigh much, but to him it was like a bundle of dynamite for the battle ahead. In the distance, headlights flared, sweeping across his face for a second before vanishing. A black sedan rolled slow, noiseless, until it came to a stop a short distance away. The window slid down, and the gleam of a camera lens caught the moonlight. The shutter snapped in quick bursts, capturing him over and over, before the car drifted off without a word. David sat alone in the small rented room on the edge of town, the glow of a desk lamp washing over his worn face. On the table sat the hard drive he had taken from the old house. He hooked up the cables, and the battered computer flickered to life, its pale blue light shining in his eyes, pulling him back to another battlefield, a battlefield of truth this time. File after file lined the screen, each stamped with dates and hours, each one running longer than he wished to see. He drew a deep breath, his heartbeat slowing like a soldier preparing to step onto a minefield. He opened the most recent clip, and there it was. The stairway to the basement, dim light flickering, and Victor pulling Anna by the arm. David froze. In the grainy footage, the little girl struggled, her small hands clawing at the railing, but Victor shoved her coldly down the steps. He locked the door, then turned back toward the camera as if he knew someone might be watching, and smiled. That smile sliced David's chest open. His teeth clenched, his hand trembled on the mouse. He skipped ahead to another file. This one showed Anna tied to a broken chair, her mouth taped shut, her eyes drowning in tears. Victor stood over her, his voice low and cruel. "You have to learn to obey. This is how I'll teach you." Each word spilling from those tiny speakers stabbed into David like a knife. He remembered days in combat, watching men fall around him before he could save them, but none of that compared to this helplessness. This was his daughter, his own blood, and she was being brutalized inside the very walls he once built for her. His head dropped into his hands, heavy breaths rattling from his chest, his eyes blurred with rage and grief. He clicked through more clips, his jaw tightening with each one. Anna, curled in the corner of the basement, trembling, whispering, "Daddy," through choked sobs. David wanted to smash the screen, wanted to drive straight back and wrap his hands around Victor's throat until nothing was left. But reason pulled him back. This footage was the only weapon he had. It didn't just expose cruelty, it exposed the truth about the man hiding behind the title of stepfather, the truth that a court could not ignore. He printed out a handful of copies, slid the memory card into the inside pocket of his shirt. He knew exactly where he had to bring it. This was his chance to make Victor answer for every bruise, every tear. But just as he pulled the hard drive free, the screen went black with a sharp snap of the breaker. The room fell into complete darkness. David shot up, his heart pounding, ears straining for any sound. Through the crack in the curtain, headlights swept past, then halted. A car idled just outside. A figure stood beside it, the tip of a cigarette glowing red in the night, smoke curling slowly into the air. He wasn't moving. He was waiting. And David knew, without question, that whoever was out there knew exactly where he was. The next morning, David walked into the county police station with the copies of the videos in hand. His face was worn down, his eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep. He sat waiting on the hard plastic chair, every minute dragging out like an hour. When they finally called him in, he set the hard drive, the memory card, and the printed images on the wooden desk. His voice shook but carried its weight. "This is evidence. My daughter was held captive, abused in the basement of my own house." The duty officer, a middle-aged man with a heavy gut, looked up briefly, then shrugged. He slid the USB in, watched a few clips on the screen, and within seconds shut the laptop. His voice was flat, empty of any urgency. Doesn't prove much. Kids exaggerate. Your ex-wife has remarried. It's a sensitive situation. We can't move forward without something more formal. David's hands clenched, his nails digging into his palm. You're seeing it right here. She's tied up, gagged. That's as clear as it gets. But the officer only shook his head, his eyes slipping away. You know Victor Hale? He's got connections in this town. People trust him. They don't trust a veteran with a PTSD file. Be careful, or you're only making things harder for yourself. The words landed like steel, cold and final. David felt the blood rush to his head, but he kept his voice under control. If you won't act, I'll take this straight to the state office. The officer smirked, grinding a cigarette butt into the ashtray on his desk. Do what you want. But take some advice. Don't go up against Victor. He's got lawyers. He's got the mayor behind him. What do you have, other than your war stories? David rose from the chair, his hands trembling with anger. He gathered the files, turned, and walked out with a bitter knot tightening in his throat. At the reception desk, the other officers glanced his way, their faces blank, their eyes hard. Not a nod, not a sign of recognition. The whole place felt like a wall built against him, thick, cold, unfeeling. Outside, the wind kicked up, dry leaves swirling around his boots, the sound like hollow laughter chasing him down the steps. He climbed into his truck, turned the ignition, but sat still. His hands gripped the wheel, his eyes staring dead ahead. Memories from the battlefield came rushing back, the times when cries for help were met with silence, the moments when men went down and command said nothing. And now, here on American soil, his little girl was being abandoned to the same silence. Bitterness welled in his chest, sharp enough to choke him. He slid the memory card into his shirt pocket, his jaw setting hard. If the law had chosen to blind itself, then he would have to find another way. But just as the engine turned over, the rearview mirror caught a sight that stopped him cold. The same black sedan from the night before, parked across the street, its lights off, a shadow inside with a camera lens pointed straight at him. That night, David drove back down the road that led to the old house. The moon threw a weak light over the empty pavement, the night wind rustling through the trees like whispers warning him off. He stopped the truck in a patch of dirt a few dozen yards away, cut the headlights, and sat still, listening. From a distance, the house lay in darkness, only a single upstairs window leaking a faint yellow glow. He pulled a deep breath into his lungs, adjusted the straps on his pack, and stepped out. Every move was careful, measured, like a soldier slipping into a reconnaissance mission he'd done too many times before. He worked his way along the fence, keeping low, his boots touching down soft against damp earth. Every sense sharpened, the crunch of a dry leaf under his sole jolting his heart. When he reached the back door, he saw it right away. The lock on the basement hatch had been replaced. A new chunk of metal gleamed silver in the moonlight, stiff and cold. A silent message. Victor knew he'd come back. David pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath. From deep inside, in that black void, came a sound he knew too well. At first a whimper, then rising, breaking apart into a cry. "Daddy, Daddy, I'm here." Anna's voice, hoarse, ragged, as though scraped raw. His chest locked tight. His hand gripped the crowbar tucked inside his pack, sweat running down his back, though the night air bit cold. Fear and urgency tangled, spinning his head. He wanted to smash that lock, tear it open, but his mind shouted at him if he made noise now. Victor would be on him, and every scrap of evidence he'd gathered would vanish into nothing. He backed away, eyes climbing to the small basement window, no bigger than a hand, set high in the wall. Inside, a flickering fluorescent bulb threw light across a small body shaking in the corner. Anna, her arms bound, hair a tangled mess falling across her face, eyes wide and spilling fear. The sight strangled David's throat. His fingers dug into the wall, nails splitting without him noticing. A sound broke from inside the house, heavy footsteps dragging slow across the wooden floor. David dropped low, ducking into the brush near the porch. The back door creaked open, light spilling out as Victor stepped into the night, his bulk filling the threshold. A ring of keys swung in his hand, catching a glint under the moon. He bent down to check the basement lock, a small smirk pulling at his mouth, the look of a man convinced he'd already won. David froze, crowbar handle pressed tight in his palm, every muscle pulled taut like wire ready to snap. One wrong move, Victor would spot him crouched, just feet away. Victor slid a key into the lock, twisted it, then tapped the metal like he was testing it for strength. He muttered something under his breath, too low for David to catch. From below, Anna's cries broke out again, desperate, and were cut short when Victor barked a single word. Silence crashed down over everything. David pressed his back to the wall, eyes clamped shut, his body trembling with the force of holding himself back. Victor straightened, turning toward the door, when a phone rang in his pocket. He answered, his voice low, sharp. "Everything's ready? Tonight it has to be done." David's lungs froze, his ears straining, and in that instant, he saw Victor slip a thick envelope into his coat pocket. The corner caught the light, stamped with a red seal, the words clear even from where David crouched. Helix Research Labs. David pressed his back hard against the wall, his heart pounding like a war drum. The last words of Victor's phone call still hung in the air when he turned toward the back door. David knew he couldn't let him take Anna away again. Rage surged through him, driving every muscle. He burst out from the shadows, crowbar swinging for the hand clutching the keys. Metal struck metal with a sharp crack. Victor staggered back, shock flashing across his face, but only for a moment. His eyes flared with fire, his stance tightening like a man who'd been waiting for this fight all along. The two men collided, their bodies slamming into the damp ground. David struck again and again, each blow carrying the weight of years lost away from his daughter. But Victor was no stranger to violence. He was bigger, heavier, and he'd fought his share of battles. His fist came down like a hammer across David's jaw, white light bursting then fading to black. David tried to hold on, but a knee drove hard into his gut, stealing his breath, sending him crumpling. Before he could rise, Victor's steel rod came down on his temple with a sickening crack. The world spun, shattered light exploding into sparks. A low roar filled David's ears, like wind cutting through a canyon. He collapsed, his cheek pressed against wet grass, the chill of the earth soaking through him. Blood seeped from his wound, dripping into the dirt. Somewhere in the haze, he heard footsteps dragging, the rattle of keys, and then Anna's cry, a sharp scream that broke into silence almost instantly. His vision blurred, but one image cut through the fog. Victor hauling Anna through the narrow basement window, a dark cloth tied across her mouth. Her legs kicked, her muffled sobs stifled in the night. David tried to lift his arm, tried to crawl, but his body was stone. Pain radiated from his temple through every limb, each movement stabbing deeper. Darkness crept closer, swallowing the edges of his sight. Victor threw Anna over his shoulder, his frame looming tall under the moon. Her cries faded as the basement door groaned open again, its hinges screaming like the earth itself in pain. David's lips parted, his voice broken, whispering her name like it might be his last breath. The sound dissolved into the cold night. The door slammed shut, the lock twisting, heavy and final. Silence closed in, suffocating. David lay sprawled in the yard, blood pooling, the night wrapping him whole. And just before the last threads of consciousness snapped, he caught sight of headlights, one car creeping slow from the end of the road, its beams cutting through the dark. David opened his eyes into a blur of darkness. The smell of dried blood clung to his face, every breath scraping his chest like broken glass. Dawn was breaking, mist heavy across the yard where he had collapsed the night before. He pressed a hand to the ground, his whole body drained, his skull ringing with pain. But he forced himself up. Only one thought hammered through him. Anna was still down in that basement. His steps faltered, each one dragging as though his body weighed 100 pounds more than it should. He staggered to his truck, pulled the door open, and dropped into the driver's seat. His hand shook as he fumbled for his phone. The screen was cracked, but still glowing. Only one name he could call. Mike Turner, his old brother in arms, the man who'd shared foxholes and night watches, the only survivor of that ambush years ago. David punched the number, his voice ragged when the line picked up. "Mike, it's me. I need you." Not half an hour later, a grey-blue pickup rolled to a stop on the dirt road. Mike climbed out, lean and wiry, his eyes sharp as a blade. He looked David over, said nothing, just hooked an arm under his shoulder and helped him into the cab. "What's going on?" Mike asked, short and straight. David reached into his pocket, pulled out the memory card, blood smeared across his trembling hand. "He's keeping Anna in the basement. I've got proof, but the cops don't care. I can't do this alone." His voice cracked, half anger, half heartbreak. Mike gave a slight nod, no wasted words. He dug into his pack, pulled out a pair of binoculars and a small recorder. "We watch him. Catch him dirty before he makes a move." For the first time in days, David felt a spark flare in the dark. He wasn't alone anymore. They set up in a thin stretch of woods across from the house. From there, they had a clear view of the basement door out back. Mike mounted the camera, tightened the lens. "We document everything," he said, voice steady. David crouched beside him, eyes glued to the scope, heart pounding with a mix of fear and raw hope. The world outside blurred with morning fog, but inside him, that hope burned like a small flame refusing to go out. When the first light cracked the horizon, The basement door swung open. Victor stepped out, dragging a heavy metal container. David's grip clenched on the seat, his body trembling. Mike raised a finger to his lips, silent, and swung the camera to catch every detail. Victor set the container down, popped it open, and a sharp chemical stench spilled into the air. He pulled on gloves, poured the contents into a glass bottle marked with a faded label. David narrowed his eyes, caught the words scrawled across it, "Test Sample 8Y." The camera lens followed Victor's every move, slow and steady, and David could feel the blood in his veins turn to ice. It wasn't just abuse anymore. What Victor was doing crossed into something darker, something beyond cruelty. Mike leaned in, twisting the lens tighter, zooming in on the details. Inside that metal container, along with the glass bottles scrawled with crude labels, lay syringes wrapped carefully in plastic, their steel glinting cold under the beam of the headlamp strapped to Victor's forehead. David's breathing quickened. His hand clamped so hard his knuckles went bone white. They waited until Victor disappeared back into the house before shifting from their post. Mike moved first, his steps sinking into the wet, rotted leaves without a sound. David followed close, chest heaving, forcing his breath low. The basement door was still locked from the outside, but Mike was ready. He pulled a small kit from his pocket, set to work, and in less than a minute, the latch snapped with a soft click. The wooden door creaked open, spilling out a wave of mildew and something acrid, sharp enough to twist David's stomach. He stepped onto the first stair, heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed off the stone, and what he saw at the bottom froze him in place. Anna lay strapped to a metal bed, her small arms punctured with needle marks, red welts oozing at the edges. Tubes ran from her skin into bottles lined neatly on a table, each marked with codes and numbers. On the stained wall, a whiteboard sagged under a mess of scribbled notes. EH, strong reaction, increased dosage. The basement didn't look like a place to keep a child. It looked like a lab cobbled together for experiments no one should ever endure. David's knees almost buckled beneath him. He stumbled forward, his daughter's name breaking from his throat, rough and trembling. Anna stirred, her eyes cloudy, lips trembling as she whispered, "Daddy." The word was so faint it could have slipped away with the air. David's hands shook as he tore at the straps, his chest torn wide open with love and rage. Behind him, Mike stood with the camera steady, jaw clenched, recording every detail. Then David's eyes caught something else, a file folder lying on the table. He grabbed it, flipped it open, and his stomach dropped. Page after page, notes written in a detached, clinical hand. Red sample test, subject 8Y, cellular reaction above threshold. Maintain weekly injections. Each line cut into him. His little girl wasn't just being hurt. She was being used her blood. Her body turned into some twisted experiment. He snapped the folder shut and stuffed it inside his jacket. He turned back to Anna, trying to lift her from the bed, when the sound reached them. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, each one descending from the floor above. They were headed straight for the open basement door. The footsteps came heavier, closer, hammering down the basement stairs like knocks announcing disaster. David dropped the folder onto the floor and pulled Anna tight against him, his body a shield. Mike gripped the camera harder, eyes strung tight as wire. The door swung open, and it wasn't Victor standing there. It was Rachel. She froze in the frame of the doorway, her eyes darting wide like someone caught red-handed in a crime she could no longer hide. David locked eyes with her. Anger and heartbreak fused into one word. Why? Rachel's hands clutched at the hem of her shirt, trembling. She stepped closer, her lips moving without sound. Anna burrowed deeper into her father's chest, her weak breath trembling against him. David's heart slammed against his ribs, threatening to split him in half. Finally, Rachel let out a single phrase, her voice cracking into the air. For money and the debt. The words hit harder than any blow, short and merciless. David went still, staring at the woman who once shared a home, who once made vows before God at his side. What he had expected, regret, pleas, maybe even shame, was nowhere to be found. Only the bare truth. She had left their daughter to be used like an experiment, traded her child's pain for numbers in a bank account, for a way out from under her debts. His chest ached sharp, tendons straining, breath ragged. "You even know what she's been through," he growled, his voice torn raw, pointing at the red punctures still fresh on Anna's arm. Rachel flinched back, her eyes glassy but dry. "You don't understand. Victor promised to clear it, promised to take care. I had no choice." The weak excuse salted the wound. David stepped forward, closing the gap to a single breath, his eyes burning red. "You had a choice. You could have protected her." The basement air pressed down thick, stinking of chemicals, his own heartbeat pounding louder than anything else. Mike didn't move, recording it all, his face like stone. He knew this wasn't just evidence, It was betrayal laid bare. Rachel lowered her head, her hands trembling, but she didn't deny it. Anna whimpered in David's arms, her shallow breath pulling him back from the edge of rage. He bent down, holding her close, trying to soothe. But when he lifted his head again, Rachel's eyes had shifted. No longer panic, something darker. She looked at him, her words faint but sharp as glass. "You can't win, David. Victor isn't the only one." And right then, the roar of engines shook the ground outside. Headlights sliced through the cracks of the basement door, flooding the dark with a brutal white glare. 3 days later, David found an envelope waiting for him at the door of the small rented room. White paper, a red seal stamped hard across the flap. Inside, the words were cold, precise. He was being summoned to county court, charged with unlawful entry and assault on Victor Hale. The black type bled off the page like a sentence already passed. David sat at the small table, the paper trembling in his hand as he read line after line. He had spent a lifetime facing rifles and bombs head-on, but never had he felt so strangled by something as lifeless as paper. Mike sat across from him, drumming his fingers lightly on the wood. "It's a counterattack," he said flat. "He knows we've seen too much. Now he wants to tear down your credibility before you can bring the evidence forward." David exhaled, the sound heavy, crushed deep inside his chest. In his mind, he saw Anna lying in that basement, arms marked by needles, and yet now the court was ready to paint him as the criminal. Anger swelled like fire, but outside the window, the sky stayed grey, solid, without a sliver of light breaking through. On the day of the hearing, David wore an old shirt, buttoned to the throat, standing tall in the dock. Across the room, Victor sat clean in a tailored suit, face polished into the role of an upstanding man. At his side, a lawyer gleamed with confidence. Rachel sat behind them, eyes lowered, refusing to meet David's gaze. The prosecutor read out the charges, tone flat and practiced. The defendant unlawfully entered private property, inflicted injury upon Mr. Triber, Victor Hale, and threatened the safety of his household. Each word drove in like a blade. David wanted to shout the truth, wanted to hold the video high, but the prosecutor cut him off. "That evidence is inadmissible, collected illegally." A murmur rippled through the room. David clenched his jaw until it ached, his fists balling tight at his sides. Injustice burned like acid, but he held himself still. At the back, Mike gave a slow nod, eyes signaling patience. David swallowed hard, heat roaring in his chest, but his head forced itself clear. One slip, and the whole fight would tumble into ruin. When it was done, the judge's words fell quick and merciless. The defendant, David Carter, is barred from approaching Victor Hale or his family within 50 meters. The gavel hit like an executioner's hammer, smashing the thin thread of hope he had left. David walked out into daylight, the sun cutting bright, but in his eyes there was only black weight pressing down. A soldier who only wanted to save his daughter, now shackled by the warped hand of the law. He stood on the courthouse steps, the envelope pressed tight in his palm, sweat running down his back. Only 2 words filled him: injustice. Mike came to his side, a hand heavy on his shoulder. "This is just the opening move. He's strong, but we're not alone." David gave the smallest nod, though his throat was knotted shut. He knew the fight had shifted. It would not be won inside a courtroom. It would have to move to where Victor's reach couldn't twist it. As they crossed the lot, a black car rolled slow toward them. The back window slid down, and there was Victor, seated calm, a thin smile curling his lips. His eyes, cold as stone, locked on David. Then he raised a fresh stack of papers, crisp, stamped with the bold red seal of the county, a petition for guardianship of Anna Carter. The courthouse that morning felt like a cold tomb, the ceiling high and the white light beating down over every row of benches. David walked in wearing a clean shirt that was still wrinkled, the heels of his worn shoes creaking against the wood floor. His heart hammered heavy as stone when his eyes found Anna in the front row, sitting between 2 lawyers who worked for Victor. She looked smaller, thinner, her hair messy around her shoulders, her eyes empty. David wanted to break forward, to scoop her up, but a deputy's hand cut across his chest, a stiff, silent warning. He was forced back to his place, standing like a stranger at the edges of his own child's life. Victor's lawyer rose smooth and polished, his voice like a speech rehearsed 1,000 times. He laid out the accusations in a tone slick as oil. David was a veteran, scarred by war, unstable, quick to anger, unfit to raise a child. He held up papers, medical records, old army reports. Page after page displayed before the court as if they were proof of a man's failure. David stood still, but each word tore through him, stripping him bare in front of strangers. When it was finally his turn, David spoke just one thing. "She's my daughter. I'm bound to protect her." His voice was rough, his eyes bloodshot and burning. But those words, simple and honest as they were, vanished into the air, powerless against the machine turning around Victor. Across the room, Victor sat in his pressed suit, the picture of a model citizen. He didn't need to say much. He just dipped his head, letting the lawyer do the dirty work. The judge struck the gavel, his tone heavy but firm. "Temporary custody of Anna Carter is granted to Mr. Victor Hale until further ruling." The sentence fell like a death blow. David felt the ground collapse under him, his chest hollowing out, his breath locking tight. In front of him, Anna was led from her seat, her voice thin and breaking "Daddy," but it was smothered as a hand pulled her away. David collapsed into the bench, both hands covering his face. He had fought through battlefields, watched men fall all around him, but this pain, losing his daughter in plain sight, ripped him deeper than any wound. Mike sat behind, his hand landing heavy on David's shoulder, but it couldn't anchor a man already sliding into despair. When the court adjourned, David stumbled out onto the steps into the sharp sunlight, his eyes vacant. By the door, Victor held Anna's hand, wearing that half smile, his cold eyes slashing across David like a blade. Anna turned her head back, tears streaking down her cheeks, but she was tugged away before she could linger. David stood frozen, trembling, no sound leaving his mouth. His daughter was gone, at least on paper, stolen by the law. Mike came beside him, voice low, rough with gravel. "If the law's been bought, we'll find another way." David didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the empty space that had just swallowed Anna's small frame. Then, as they reached their truck, a plain envelope slipped beneath the wiper. Inside was a blurred photograph. Anna strapped to a metal bed in the basement, beside her a glass vial glowing red, stamped with a single label, Project Ember. David sat frozen in the truck, his hand crushing the blurred photograph until it wrinkled and tore, his eyes locked on the image of Anna strapped to that metal bed with needles running into her arm. Every detail in that picture was a blade straight to his chest. The law had turned its back on him, the court had stripped him of his right to be a father, and now this photograph, slipped under his wiper like some cruel whisper, dropped the truth in his lap. If he waited any longer, his daughter would be gone for good. He pulled in a deep breath, the smell of hot plastic mixing with the copper tang of dried blood still clinging to his forehead. He knew he had come to the stretch of road where there was no turning back. Mike sat beside him, quiet, steady, watching. He didn't ask questions, he just waited. Finally, David spoke, his voice low, hoarse, but hard as iron. "I'm bringing her out, no matter what it takes." Mike nodded slow, the eyes of an old soldier who understood what that meant. They'd broken rules in war zones before. The only difference now was the battlefield had shifted onto American soil. They started to prepare. Mike popped the trunk and pulled out a canvas bag stuffed with rope, flashlights, and an old handgun that still fired. David didn't speak. He just checked each item, his calloused hands shaking at first, then firming as the safety clicked into place with a sharp snap. A plan began forming in his head. No more trying to prove anything. No more waiting for permission. He was going to rip his child back from the hands of the man who had turned her into an experiment. When night fell, they spread out a rough map of Victor's property on the wooden table in the rented room. Mike traced a route through the western fence line, where the cameras were few. David nodded, his eyes narrow, the same look he'd worn back when they planned night patrols overseas. Only now, the enemy wasn't an insurgent with a rifle. It was a man who carried legal custody papers in his pocket. That bitter truth only sharpened David's resolve. He packed light, just a backpack with enough space to carry Anna to safety. Inside his chest, his heart thudded, not with fear, but with something sharper, a pure edge of recklessness. He knew this night could be the end of everything, his freedom, maybe even his life. But the thought of his daughter, trapped and used like a lab animal, left him no other path. Mike gave him a long look, his voice raspy. "Once we start, there's no way back." David answered short. "I was never planning to back up." Lee. They slipped out of the room just past midnight, the back roads empty, silent. The sound of the tires on asphalt beat like a slow war drum, carrying them into a fight no court record would ever mention. The yellow glow of the street lamps washed across David's face, showing eyes stripped of hesitation, stripped of everything but purpose. As the truck turned down the familiar road that led toward the old house, both men spotted it at the same time. Up ahead, in a pocket of darkness, a black SUV sat waiting, its lights dead. The only sign of life, the faint red flicker of a cigarette burning in the driver's seat. The black SUV sat outside the house like some predator crouched in the dark, waiting for the right second to strike. But David and Mike didn't slow down. They killed the headlights, let the truck roll silently into the empty lot a little ways down, and stepped out without a word. David swung the backpack over his shoulders. Inside was a rope, a flashlight, an old pistol, and a few loose rounds. Mike checked the folding knife in his belt and the heavy bolt cutters he carried like an extra limb. They didn't need to speak. A short nod between them was enough. The kind of unspoken understanding only men who had been through too much could share. Tonight they either brought Anna out alive, or they wouldn't be walking out at all. They moved along the western fence line, the side David remembered from his earlier scout. He knew the placement of every camera, every blind spot. Mike clipped the wire clean through, the steel strands snapping with a faint metallic whine that still made both their hearts jump. The night wind picked up, tossing dry leaves in circles, masking the sound with its restless rustling. They slipped through the gap and dropped into the backyard, the house looming over them like a coffin waiting for its lid to be nailed shut. David crouched low, pressing one hand to the cold ground, his body still using old battlefield habits. He let the earth tell him what he couldn't hear. No dogs barking, no hum of engines, just silence, a silence that felt like a held breath. The cellar door was still bolted tight, a brand new lock gleaming under the moonlight like a dare. Mike set down his cutters and pulled a slim kit from his pocket. David stood over him with the pistol raised, watching the shadows, counting his own heartbeat. Seconds stretched, then the lock popped with a small sharp click. David eased the door open, and the stench hit them damp, chemical, the smell of rot, and something worse. The flashlight beam slid down the steps, swallowed by a darkness that clung like tar. The walls were stained, wet in places, shadows shifting as the light trembled across them. They moved down, slow, rifles of breath locked in their chests. At the bottom, a weak fluorescent light flickered from a workbench. Glass jars, scattered across the surface, bubbled with some thick red fluid that clung to the glass like blood trying to climb free. The air burned their eyes. David swept the beam left, and his knees nearly buckled. Anna, his daughter, tied to a metal bed frame, her small body barely more than skin and bones, fresh bruises blooming like cruel fingerprints on her arms. Her eyes opened halfway, and when she saw him, something flickered alive inside them. The faintest light, the last spark of hope. David dropped the flashlight, rushed to her side, his hands shaking so bad he could barely cut the ropes. "Daddy's here. You're safe now," he whispered, voice breaking. Anna gasped, a weak nod, a sob catching in her throat. Mike stood behind, covering the stairs, gun fixed on the darkness above. The air pressed down on them, thick as smoke, but for that breath of a moment, David felt like the fight was won. Then the hammer fell. A heavy crash from above shook the walls. The cellar door slammed shut, the lock twisting hard with a sound like bones snapping. From the speakers wired into the corners, Victor's voice rolled down, low and flat, full of quiet malice. "You think you can just take her away, David? Tonight, it's you who won't be walking out of here." Victor's voice poured down through the speaker system, cold and sharp, the kind of sound you felt more in your bones than in your ears. David gripped the pistol until his knuckles went white, his eyes locked on the black staircase above. He knew damn well Victor wasn't coming down yet. The man was playing a game, stretching the moment like a cat with a half-dead mouse. Mike, steady as always, motioned for David to hold his fire, then turned his flashlight toward the long table set up like a laboratory bench. The beam cut through the stale darkness, and what it revealed made the air catch in both men's throats. It wasn't just the bubbling red vials anymore that was bad enough. It was the cardboard boxes stacked in neat columns against the wall, each heavy with files. Mike pulled one loose, flipped through quickly, then froze. His voice rasped, tight and stunned. Jesus Christ. The words on the page weren't written like stories. They were clinical, stripped of feeling. Subject 7Y. Male. Weak response, terminated. Subject 9 farads. Female. Missing, presumed lost. Line after line, file after file, each one a child reduced to a code, a date of birth, a handful of statistics, a cold outcome. David felt his throat close. His vision blurred. His hands shook as he yanked another file out of the box. This one carried photographs, grainy, printed on cheap paper. Small faces, hollow-cheeked, eyes wide with terror, bound to chairs or chained to iron beds in the same kind of shadows that Anna had been forced into. Not one child, not two, dozens, maybe hundreds. David's knees buckled, and he dropped hard onto the damp cement floor. The shock of cold didn't matter. His stomach surged like he was going to vomit, but he forced it down. He had seen body bags stacked in trucks overseas, seen villages reduced to dust, heard the cries of mothers clawing at rubble. But this was different. This wasn't war. This wasn't chance. This was deliberate. This was children stolen, stripped of names, of futures, of life itself. turned into experiments. And his daughter, his Anna, was just one more file number in the machine. Mike stacked more files on the table, his face shadowed, jaw clamped so tight it looked carved from stone. His voice was gravel. He's not doing this alone. No way. This is too big. Helix Research Labs, that's the front. Behind it, you've got a whole network. Trafficking, experimenting, selling kids like cattle. The words rattled through David like shrapnel. His insides twisted. He couldn't breathe right. How many kids? How many families had been gutted? How many fathers like him walking around right now, thinking their children were lost to divorce, to custody, to chance, never knowing they'd been taken into something like this? His hands clutched the file until the paper crumpled, his pulse hammering in his ears. The numbers and codes on the pages seemed to burn, each one a brand pressed into his chest. The anger, the disgust, the helplessness, all rolled together until he was shaking. His teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. He muttered through the pressure, voice thin as wire. Anna's not going to be one of these numbers. Mike lifted his chin, eyes catching the beam of the flashlight. He gave a single sharp nod. Determination. No more waiting. No more playing by rules written by men who had already sold their souls. They worked fast, pulling the most damning files and shoving them into David's backpack. Evidence, proof. Weapons that couldn't fire bullets, but could burn down an empire. David scooped Anna into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. Her breath warmed his neck in tiny gasps, each one weaker than the last. He pressed her against him, swore silently he wouldn't set her down again until she was free. Then the sound came. Metal grinding deep and harsh, echoing off the concrete walls. They spun around, guns raised. A whole section of wall was moving, sliding sideways with a hiss of hidden hydraulics. David swung the flashlight, and what it showed froze his blood. Behind that shifting wall was another chamber, sealed by thick glass now fogged with condensation. Through it, row after row of small iron beds stretched into the dark. IV lines dangled like spider legs from overhead racks, needles still taped to tubing, waiting for veins. On the floor, little shirts, tiny shoes, socks with cartoon prints were scattered in piles. The room stank of bleach and iron, the stink of a slaughterhouse pretending to be clean. David staggered back, clutching Anna tighter, his mind screaming even as his mouth stayed locked. Mike lowered the camera for a second, his hands trembling despite himself. For both men, the truth was no longer a suspicion, no longer a handful of files. It was right there, in that hidden ward, a factory for breaking children. David's voice cracked, low and raw. We're not just fighting him, we're fighting all of it. Mike met his eyes, and for once, there was no calm in the older man's face, only fire. Then we burn it down. The intercom crackled again. Victor's chuckle slid into the room, thin and poisonous. Now you see. Now you finally understand what she means to us. She's not just a little girl. She's a key, and you've already lost. End of flow. David felt his hand steady on the pistol. His heart beat into a rhythm that wasn't fear anymore, it was war. The truth was out, and the fight had only just begun. The roar of machinery rolled through the earth, shaking the concrete walls until dust rained down from the ceiling like grey snow. David held Anna against his chest, every muscle in his body tight as wire, his eyes fixed on the wall that had begun to shift open. What lay beyond was no doorway to freedom. It was a tunnel of black, a hole that breathed menace. Out of it stepped Victor, tall enough to block the passage completely. In his hand gleamed a pistol, its polished surface catching the flicker of the overhead lights. His smile was thin, cold, his eyes glowing with the satisfaction of a man who thought the game already won. His voice was low, deliberate, dripping with mockery. You really thought you could take her from me, David? Mike didn't flinch. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Victor and the father, clutching his daughter. His arm lifted, gun aimed steady, his jaw set like stone. He didn't bother with warnings. His presence alone was the line in the sand. The room tightened, the silence so taut it hummed. In that breathless instant, every soul in the bunker knew it, one twitch, and hell would break loose. Victor twitched first. He squeezed the trigger, the blast deafening, fire and smoke bursting from the barrel. The bullet smashed into the wall inches above Mike's head, cement exploding in a shower of shards. Mike returned fire instantly, the flash from his muzzle lighting the room in sharp bursts, the air filling with the acrid taste of gunpowder. David pulled Anna down behind the laboratory bench, his heart pounding so hard it rattled his ribs, his ears ringing as more shots cracked through the cavern. Glass shattered, vials exploded. A thick red chemical splattered across the floor, mingling with the blood seeping from the gash along David's arm where a bullet had grazed him. The pain was sharp, searing, but he bit it back, holding his daughter close, refusing to let her slip from his grip. Victor charged, his boots slamming into the heavy table, flipping it aside like cardboard. The force sent David sprawling onto the slick floor, the wind knocked from his chest. Mike fired twice more, one round catching Victor in the shoulder. The man's dark suit blossomed crimson, his body jolted by the impact. But still he stayed on his feet, face twisted, eyes wild with rage. He bellowed, a sound part human, part beast, and lunged. He smashed into Mike, their bodies colliding like rams. Mike's gun flew across the room, clattering into the shadows. They grappled, fists hammering, bones cracking, grunts and snarls echoing off the walls. Victor's strength was brutal, honed not by training but by a life of bare-knuckle survival. Mike fought with the stubborn ferocity of age, his body giving ground but his will refusing to yield. David, blood streaming into his eyes, staggered upright. His vision blurred, but instinct, the old soldier's instinct, guided him. He hurled himself forward, wrapping his arms around Victor from behind, dragging the man to the floor. They crashed onto the cement, bodies rolling, fists slamming, steel scraping. Victor's pistol skittered away into the darkness. Anna screamed, a sound that cut through the thunder of combat like a blade. Her voice, raw and terrified, dragged David back from the edge of collapse. He summoned everything he had left, slammed his forehead into Victor's face. The crunch of bone was sickening, the spray of blood hot against David's cheek. Victor roared, half in pain, half in fury, and his hand flashed to his belt. Steel gleamed. A knife, short and wicked, appeared in Victor's fist. The blade arced downward, aimed for David's chest. For a split second, the world froze. David thrust up his hand, catching the strike by pure instinct. The knife tore through his palm, blood erupting, scalding, blinding in its agony. He cried out, the sound ripped from his lungs, but his other hand clamped down on Victor's wrist, holding, straining, refusing to let the steel fall again. Mike crawled across the floor, ribs screaming, eyes locked on the pistol lying in the corner. Each movement was a battle, each breath ragged, but he pushed forward, dragging himself through the glass and blood. His fingers closed around the weapon. He lifted it, arms trembling, chest heaving. His voice cracked, raw and urgent. David, down. On sheer instinct, David twisted, throwing his weight to the side. The blade tore free of his flesh, spraying blood. Victor's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with triumph for a heartbeat, then confusion as he saw the barrel pointed square at him. The gunshot was thunder, the recoil kicking through Mike's tired body. The bullet slammed into Victor's chest dead center. The force knocked him back flat against the floor. His mouth opened, a wet gasp tearing out as blood spread across his shirt in a dark, spreading pool. His knife clattered free, his fingers twitching uselessly. The room went still. Only the faint hiss of dripping IV lines filled the silence, each drop hitting the concrete like the ticking of a clock, counting down the last seconds of a life. David collapsed beside Anna, wrapping her small body in his bloodied arms. She sobbed against him, fragile but alive, her breath fluttering against his chest like the beat of a bird's wing. Victor lay sprawled, chest heaving shallow, his skin pale, lips streaked with blood. Yet even as his life drained, his mouth curled into a faint smile. His voice rasped, broken but clear enough to stab the heart. You think this is over? You fools, you haven't won. His eyes clouded, his body shuddered, but the words hung in the air like a curse, promising that the darkness wouldn't vanish with his death. David stared at him, every nerve torn raw, his soul emptied by the toll of the fight. Killing the man hadn't brought relief, it hadn't brought peace, it had left only exhaustion, only the hollow ache of a father clinging to a child nearly stolen forever. He staggered to his feet, Anna held tight against his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. But before he could take a step, the bunker itself groaned. The ceiling rumbled, dust cascading in sheets, the ground shuddering beneath them. Sirens wailed above, their piercing cries drawing closer, louder, overlapping with the strobe of blue and red light, bleeding through cracks in the hatchway above. Help, or judgment, he couldn't know which. All David knew was that time was running out, and the fight for his daughter's life was not finished yet. The sirens screamed high and sharp, cutting through the heavy air of the bunker like blades. Red and blue light spilled through the crack of the hatch, streaking across the damp walls. David clutched Anna to his chest, his heart hammering, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could breathe. Beside him, Mike stood firm, blood seeping through his shoulder, his pistol still locked in his hand, his eyes like steel. They both knew the fight was over, at least here, though the cost had been steep. On the cement floor, Victor lay motionless, his blood pooling into a dark stain that spread across the concrete. His breath rattled, faded, then stopped, leaving only that final crooked smile on his lips, as if even in death he wanted to leave behind a shadow for the living to carry. The hatch burst open, beams of flashlights cut through the gloom, and the thunder of boots followed. "Drop the gun! Hands up!" a commanding voice barked. Mike lowered his weapon, letting it fall with a hollow clatter, and raised his arms high. David gave a small nod and hugged Anna tighter. A uniformed officer rushed forward, grabbing them, pulling them out into the night. But when his eyes fell on Anna, on the bruises mottling her skin, the faint mark of needles still etched into her arm, his face hardened, then faltered, a flicker of horror flashing across his expression. Behind them, Rachel was dragged down the stairs in cuffs. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. Her eyes were vacant, as if she had already surrendered every piece of herself. David looked at her for a heartbeat, and in that single glance, a storm rose inside him, rage, sorrow, and something like grief for the woman he had once trusted, the woman who had once been mother to his child, now reduced to a traitor who sold her own blood. Outside, the night air slapped his face with its bitter chill. David stepped out of the bunker holding Anna, every stride heavy with the weight of a new beginning. Police cruisers lit up the yard with their strobes, and the flashing glow reflected off Anna's fragile face as she pressed into her father's chest. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but each word carried the weight of salvation. "Daddy, I want to go home." Just 4 small words, yet they broke something deep inside him. Tears blurred his sight, burning hot as they slid down to mix with the dry blood on his cheeks. His reply came low, cracked, but steady. "We're going home. This time for real." An ambulance waited in the driveway, back doors wide. Paramedics rushed forward, lifting Anna from his arms onto a stretcher, checking her pulse, strapping monitors to her small body. David followed step for step, never releasing her hand, even as wires and cuffs wrapped around her wrists. Mike stood off to the side, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. The smoke curled around him as he watched officers shove Rachel into a patrol car. He gave David a slow nod, a silent reminder that they were alive, that somehow they had survived the night. But his eyes were tired, cloudy, carrying the knowledge that survival was only one layer of the mire they had stepped into, that deeper rot waited below. When the ambulance pulled away, sirens screaming into the night, a uniformed officer approached David and pressed a sealed envelope into his hand. Inside, pulled from Victor's safe, was a ledger. Page after page, lists of names and coded numbers, each line stamped with the word missing. Dozens of children. Each entry marked the day a family lost its future. David scanned the pages, his hands trembling, his throat locked tight. Every line was another broken home, another child erased. Relief at saving Anna shriveled into a heavier weight. The victory of a father holding his daughter alive was darkened by the truth that she was just one of many. He sat in the back of a squad car, the list clutched to his chest. The headlights carved a narrow path through the dark road, the town lights fading behind in a blur of tears. Mike slid in beside him, his voice low, rough with smoke and exhaustion. "You got Anna back, but how many more kids are still out there?" Victor was just one link. David didn't answer. He only nodded, slow and heavy, his heart sinking under the truth. He knew the shadow had not ended. It had only begun to show its edges. That night, as the car rolled away from the house that once held his family, David looked back one last time. The building stood drenched in red and blue flashes, police tape strung across its doors. To the world, it was now a crime scene. To him, it was forever a scar, a place of betrayal, of blood spilled, of tears shed in silence. He pulled a blanket up over Anna where she slept in the medic's arms, her face pale but safe. Then he lifted his gaze, eyes burning with a new fire. Because inside the envelope, at the very bottom of the list, below the words, "Subject 12 Farads, pending transfer," there was more. A line etched in bold print, an address, Ashton Quarry Facility. And that single clue told him the war was far from done. This story reminds us that sometimes the darkness isn't out there somewhere far away. It lives right inside the house, the very place that's supposed to be safe. Justice written on paper can be twisted, but the love of a father for his child is something no one can stop. For those of us who have already walked through half a lifetime, we know the greatest value isn't money or status, but holding tight to the responsibility we owe the people we love. Standing up to protect your child, to protect the truth, often means stepping into danger, but it's the only way to keep your dignity intact. And most of all, the story warns us that silence in the face of evil only feeds the darkness, but if we dare to confront it, we keep the light alive for the next generation. Are you watching this video in the morning or at night? Let me know down in the comments. And if you'd like to keep receiving heartfelt stories about soldiers coming home, Don't forget to subscribe to the Soldiers Coming Home channel and stay with us on this journey.